Good evening, everyone. Good evening because I'm in Lebanon, and welcome to this event by LAU New York. We are doing this from three campuses of LAU, from Byblos, from Beirut, and from New York. I just wanted to say hello from here. It's a very exciting panel we have and a star moderator. And I'm going to hand over to my colleague Nadia Mikdashi, whose idea this seminar was to in New York to carry on from there.
Thank you, Nadim, and welcome everyone to all our viewers here in the US and in Beirut and wherever they may be in the world. I'd like to welcome our moderator and our speakers. Thank you for being with us, and introduce Sara Ganim, who will be moderating today. Sara is a Pulitzer Prize winning journalist who has vast experience in print and broadcast. She is a Hearst Fellow, a Hearst Journalism Fellow at the University of Florida's Brechner Center, where she hosts the podcast, Why Don't We Know? So Sara, I hand over to you.
Hello, welcome everyone. I'm Sara Ganim. I am hosting the discussion today, and I'm so excited to be here with all of you, albeit virtually. I really appreciate and thank you guys for joining. I know this is going to be a really informative and very relevant discussion about something that affects all of us around the world, and that of course is the US election 1 week from today. We have with us three incredible experts who have been closely following voting trends and putting things into historical context so that the rest of us can be better informed about what is coming. And I'm very excited and thrilled to introduce them to you. Before I do, I just want to lay a few ground rules because this is, you know, kind of a new environment and different. And I just want to kind of explain how we're going to do this. So we're going to start with a couple of questions for each panelist and allow them to talk about their work and their research and why they're here today. And following those introductions, we're going to have a few preset questions that will help us kind of kick off this discussion and allow them to further share their views. We ask that during that time, you keep yourself muted. As you can, I think here right now, some people may not be muted. So we're going to ask that you keep yourself muted just to minimize distractions, and especially while they're speaking. I will be closely monitoring the chat function in the Zoom and make sure that if you have any questions during that time, you can put them into the chat. I will read them to the panelists and allow them to answer. In addition, about halfway into this, we're going to give you, the audience, the opportunity to ask more questions. And if you want to, you can ask them yourselves. Just message me in the chat and we can allow you to unmute and ask the question if you feel you know, that you would like to ask it yourself. Otherwise, you can continue to put those questions in the chat and I will continue to pass them along to the panelists. We're going to try to wrap up in about an hour. Without further ado, I'm going to introduce everyone. First, we have Naseem Haffar. He's a political organizer and private investor who previously spent 30 years in the financial industry in high yield sales, real estate finance, and international banking. He is currently the chairman of the board of the Arab American Family Support Center, a New York-based NGO dedicated to empowering immigrants and refugees with the tools they need to succeed in their new environment. He's also on the board of the Arab American Democratic Action Fund, a political action committee, and the American Task Force for Lebanon, and also the Washington Street Historical Society and the Noor Theater. He has an MBA in finance from Columbia University School of Business and a BS in the Business and International Relations from the University of Minnesota. Thanks, Naseem, for being with us. Next, we have Jeffrey Karam. He's an assistant professor of political science at the Lebanese American University, who's hosting the event today. He's also an associate at the Middle East Initiative at Harvard University's Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs. And he's an interdisciplinary and multilingual scholar, and his research and teaching spans the subfields of international relations, the international security, American foreign relations, and Middle Eastern studies. His research focuses on the politics of intelligence and national security, US Middle East relations, American foreign policy and revolutions and coups and wars in the Middle East. And he is the editor of the Middle East in 1958, Reimagining a Revolutionary Year, currently also finishing his first book. And finally, Jomana Qaddour, who is a non-resident senior fellow with the Rafiq Hariri Center in the Middle East, where she leads the Syria portfolio. Qaddour is a doctoral student at Georgetown University Law Center, focusing on ethno-sectarianism and its impact on constitutional frameworks in Iraq, Bosnia, and Syria. She is currently a member of the UN-facilitated Syrian Constitutional Committee as part of the civil society group. She is also the co-founder of Syria Relief and Development, a humanitarian organization working in Northwest Syria that has implemented over $92 million worth of aid. And she serves as the vice chairwoman of the American Relief Coalition for Syria, an umbrella group of 10 Syrian American humanitarian organizations. So that's a mouthful, but all of that to say that these are really smart people, and we are welcoming really smart questions. They can handle anything you toss their way. We're really excited to hear what they have to say. Okay, to start everybody off, I am going to go to Jeffrey for our first question. Jeffrey, this is a numbers game, right? You're watching the voting trends very closely. And that's why I want to start with you. Historically, I think many of us, especially Arab Americans, believe that Arab Americans favor the Republican Party historically on fiscal issues, on social issues. And many of them view democratic policies in the Middle East with skepticism. And then President Trump comes along and he has some very incendiary language towards Muslims and other divisive and controversial policies towards minorities. And so today, many Arab Americans consider themselves Democrats. Can you talk about that shift and when you started to see that happen? Is it a generational shift, socioeconomic, regional, something else?
Great. Thank you, Sarah, so much. And thanks to Nadim and Nadia and LEU New York for really hosting this important event. And I also thank the attendees and my fellow panelists for holding this discussion just a few days before the elections. So let me begin by saying that diversity is the name of the game when we think about this broader definition of Arab Americans. We are talking, roughly speaking, about 3.5 million to 4 million individuals living in America. If we want to use stats and look at numbers, that constitutes almost 1% of what we expect to see and what we know in terms of the population in the United States of America. I'm not gonna really focus on that as much as hopefully in the Q&A we even more talk about the diversity that we have. But what is important to keep in mind are just a couple of thoughts. Traditionally speaking, I agree with you, Sarah, that we've seen more and more Arab Americans to be close to the Republican Party. And this really has to do with fiscal policies, it has to do with the economy. But in reality, the shift did not occur with President Trump. The shift really occurred after 9/11. And 9/11 was such a foundational period and juncture. And maybe it does not translate automatically to what we saw at the polls. But in terms of getting a feel from people in the street and the attacks that they came actually under, the stereotypical language, racist language, hatred, bigotry that resurfaced very powerfully after 9/11 could be, to a large extent, the turning point that one could think of when we start to see a difference in attitude and a difference in view. But again, that doesn't really translate automatically to what we mean by elections and what we observed in different trends. And when President Obama came to power, and with the Cairo speech in 2009, that was a very important juncture, again, in trying to mend the fences, trying to try to bridge the gap, if you want, between Arab Americans and I would say even Muslim Americans, particularly when it comes to views of the Middle East and views of US foreign policy in the region, specifically after the Bush's invasion of Iraq, wars in Afghanistan, and the problems with having a clear exit strategy when it comes to what to do in Iraq and how that affected not only Arab Americans, but broadly, you could say everyone in America. So when we talk about shifts and when we talk about differences, obviously it's going to come down to issues. And that's a related point to saying when we talk about more and more Arab Americans broadly conceived, and that is problematic as a concept, obviously. If I'm going to say Lebanese Americans, if I'm going to say Syrian Americans, if I'm going to say Palestinian Americans or Yemeni Americans, we're also going to see more and more divergence when it comes to views. And what's obvious is that, yes, we see more and more Arab Americans, specifically young Arab Americans, that basically came of age during a recession in America, and then came of age during a period where Trump came to power. And it was very clear that when President Trump took office and the policies that followed with the Muslim ban and tightening up on immigration and a perceived view of empowering the economy, that did not sit well with many, many Arab Americans. And I'm not going to go into the numbers, but looking at different polls from different organizations based in America, based in the region, would clearly show that there are major differences when it comes to how they perceive many Arab Americans, the basically making and formulating of US foreign policy in their ancestral homelands. But that's not sufficient on its own in terms of an issue area. It's still going to be the economy, and it's still going to be basically really centered on, domestically speaking, how different Arab Americans are dealing with different issues, how the US government right now is handling the coronavirus and the pandemic. But to take a step back and think about bigger issues, one important point just to talk about the rift, if you want, between Democrats and Republicans when it comes to the new generation is that the new generation, in one word that I would use, are much more progressive. And when I say progressive, I mean it in a way just observing how close they were to the discourse that was being developed and sustained by Bernie Sanders before he lost basically the nomination. But what's important to keep in mind is that, does that automatically mean that these Arab Americans that are more progressive and were more leftist leaning and closer to Bernie, are they automatically going to be closer to Biden right now? I wouldn't really want to analyze that more than just saying, when it comes to actual decision making, there's always a trend that Arab Americans are very influential when it comes to partaking in elections, but that's really different than saying to what extent are they really voting at the end of the day, and to what extent can we reconcile between having an individual looking perspective that talks about the economy in America and how to reconcile that with American foreign policy in the region. And if you follow the trends the last few months, when we think about normalization between Israel and various Arab states, and especially we're talking here about the Gulf, and when we hear about other attempts at trying to reverse the Muslim ban and the attempts at the Senate to basically try to stop that, and with the recent, basically, I would say, confirmation, or what's going to be the confirmation of the justice by the Republican Party, it becomes very clear that when we think about these bigger issues, we could say that they're going to translate immediately at the electoral polls and at the voting booth. But what we've seen, and going back to your original question regarding differences in generations, that there's always been a very, very, very tough, basically, decision-making process that actually touches on what we mean by you want a strong economy, you care about fiscal policies, why you're living in America, and to what extent is that going to push you into the direction of saying it also matters for me to have a better oriented and strong foreign policy. And this is where I think the crux of the matter comes down to, which is really being able to find whether this is, again, going to be what we witnessed in 2016, a lesser of two evils argument for many Arab Americans. We don't really like Obama. We don't really like Clinton, but we're going to vote for Trump, even though we're not convinced with many things that he's saying, but we're going to vote for Trump because we tend to believe that he's going to be much more assertive, for instance, with Iran, or he's going to pull out of the deal with Iran, or he's going to try to reverse many of the policies that Obama was pushing for, which included surveillance, included drones, included many things that Arab Americans are still basically not very happy with. So I'm going to end my contribution on this segment by just saying that even if we were to think about how is it possible to reconcile between two levels of analysis, domestic concerns and foreign policy concerns, at the end of the day, it's very clear that if we were going to get into the game of numbers and we're going to say that obviously because of the immigration ban and because of the Muslim ban, many Arab Americans are closer to the Democratic Party. Many would say that is the true statement. But if you look at several states and several districts, and if you go into the particularities of different communities within the Arab American community, if you look at the Lebanese American community, if you look at the Iraqi American community, if you look at the Palestinian American community, you're also going to find there a lot of divergence when it comes to views. And that's something to keep in mind, that even if the older generation, symbolically speaking, traditionally speaking, was closer to the Republican Party, yes, there is a change right now, but I don't want to basically overinflate that change and just be realistic about it, that even that change might come down to a lesser of two evils argument than an actual shift between the Republican Party and the Democratic Party. Because if you think about the term that I used earlier on in terms of the new generation is much more progressive, and when I say much more progressive, they are thinking about their well-being when it comes to education, when it comes to the economy, when it comes to immigration, when it comes to surveillance, but also they're also trying to think about other important issues that matter to them in their ancestral homelands. And that's something that is one of the, I would say, missing dynamics or aspects that are not being totally discussed when we think about this binary regarding you're either Republican or either Democrat. This is a realistic choice at the end of the day because of the availability of candidates and the ones that can actually win. And this is part of democratic elitism when we think about it in the context of America. But when it comes to thinking about preferences and choices, I think it's much deeper than this. And it really might, in next future cycles, maybe we might find a third strong alternative that's really going to be very progressive and able to reconcile between domestic concerns and foreign policy considerations.
Okay, so this is actually a perfect segue over to my first question for Jomana, which is that Arab American is such a broad term, and it does encompass people from so many different countries and cultures and religions, and it seems impossible to lump everyone in together. Can you talk about the differences in voting trends that you're seeing among the different members of different diaspora?
Sure. Thank you, Sara, for having us, and thank you, Nadim and Nadia and Albert for organizing this. You know, I'll be very brief. I mean, I think just like any other community, the Arab American community is, you know, is not a monolith. I mean, various communities. Some of them still, for example, more closely aligned with the Republican Party, and then some, even those who would technically be considered Democrat, you know, range from progressive to centrist. And then you also have a segment of the Arab American, you know, community that I think still struggles with the notion of voting, still struggles with the notion of being a full citizen in the United States and really valuing the right to vote and the necessity of participating in politics. And I think that that's especially relevant in this election because I do think that there are a good number of Arab Americans who, disappointed by, Bernie Sanders not claiming, the Democratic Party candidacy have chosen to sit this one out. But then looking at the, the part of the community that is participating, that is active, as Jeff said, you know, various communities are voting for different reasons. I mean, obviously I'm, you know, from my bio, you can probably tell that I'm Syrian American. I've been involved heavily in a lot of the issues of the Syrian American community. And the Syrian American community tends to be much more, I would say, ranging from center right to center left. You know, one of the most important issues to them is foreign policy, and they do tend to see the Republicans, at least in the latter, you know, the past several years, even during the Obama administration, especially actually during the Obama administration, as you know, they were not willing to take some, you know, some, I think, posturing that might have deterred some of the conditions we see in Syria today. But they did, you know, want a more aggressive foreign policy. And I think that that's something that they are still concerned about. Now, as for the rest of the community, you know, I started off saying by they're not a monolith, and the reasons for that are many. I mean, even as Jeff was saying, even within the Lebanese American community, you have very different segments. And I think this reflects sort of a broader trend that we're seeing, you know, more both in the United States and in the region, of the sort of increased tribalization of you know, Arab society. I don't necessarily think there is such a thing as, you know, what a Syrian American should value, what the Syrian American stands for. I think that's really breaking down, oftentimes along religious lines, oftentimes along, you know, lines that are, you know, closer to class and education, geographic location. And so I think a lot of that's happening both in the United States, but it's, you know, more importantly, it's happening overseas. And I think the reason that's relevant is because a lot of these communities are voting with foreign policy in mind.
Great. So Naseem, this actually segues perfectly into a pretty specific question that I have, which is how these candidates are courting Arab American voters. And specifically, I want to focus on Michigan just for the purpose of the fact that it's a swing state. Trump won in 2016 by a mere 10,000 votes, which is a very small margin. And the Arab American population there is estimated to be as high as 500,000. So that population could easily swing the state one way or another. So how is each candidate working to court the voter there?
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you, Nadim and Nadia, for hosting this event. So what I'm going to talk about is not only Michigan, but also the concentrations of Arab Americans that exist in Ohio, in Pennsylvania, in California, and I think what has happened in this election cycle is that the Biden campaign has been courting Arab Americans very strongly. And I think it's a combination of two factors. One is because they do make a difference in swing states, like especially Michigan and Ohio and Pennsylvania. And second, I think there is a realization on the part of the Biden campaign that the Muslim ban, the travel ban, impacted Arab Americans' views on the Republican Party. Now, in Michigan in particular, the level of activism on the part of the Arab American community is very, very strong. Now, having said that, there's also an effort by Arab Americans for Trump. In a recent poll that is being published today, the Arab American Institute did a poll which showed that in general, in the Arab American community, about 60% will be supporting Biden and 35% will be supporting Trump. Now, surprisingly, is actually the margin between those supporting a Democrat versus those supporting a Republican has actually shrunk compared to 2016. So in 2016, it was like 60% for Trump and 25% I'm sorry, 60% for Hillary and 25% for Trump. And the reason for this drop is, I think, many people who were traditional Republicans and who were very disgusted with Trump's rhetoric. I mean, they're historically Republicans, they're conservative economically, but were disgusted with Trump. They decided to support Hillary or not vote. Right now, what we're seeing is that some of those Republicans have gotten over their distaste with Trump's character and have decided to focus on the economic issues which relate to taxes and the stock market and traditional Republican talking points. So going back to the distinctions among the various communities within the Arab American community, you have, in general, there's much stronger support for Democrats and for Biden among Muslim Arab Americans. Also, there is, I agree with the other panelists, young Arab Americans are supporting Biden. Senior Arab Americans are supporting Biden. Women Arab Americans are supporting Biden. Middle-aged Arab American men tend to vote for Trump. And that's a distinction that you see also in the general population, and that's reflected in the Arab American community. And so in Michigan, I think in terms of the various campaigns efforts, there's definitely a strong campaign effort by the Biden people, but there's really not as much by the Trump campaign, although there is a local effort by the Michigan Republican Party to motivate traditional Arab American Republicans to vote for Trump.
So we know that Bernie Sanders drew a lot of Arab Americans to the polls. And we also know that there is not as much excitement about Joe Biden. Do we have an issue with voter registration, and will we have an issue with turnout on election day? And this is obviously looking at it from a Democratic Party perspective. I'm going to open this one to anyone who wants to answer, but let's try to keep our answers to around 2 minutes just so that we can get to more questions.
Can I address that quickly, Sarah?
Of course.
Okay. So I think activism is very, very strong. There is a Arab American for Biden WhatsApp group of about 150. It's a national effort. And I have never seen the activism that I'm seeing today historically. It is mostly an effort by younger Arab Americans to call up voters, to register voters, and I think it's something that is in many ways historic. Now, that doesn't mean that there's not some support within the Arab American community for Trump, and I think there is definitely that. But I think in terms of activism, I've never seen that before within the Arab American community for Biden.
Jomana, I want to ask you the same thing. Is there the same level of excitement, or is it something that we should be worried about?
I mean, I tend to worry because I think it really just depends on who you're talking to, right? I think I would say probably the 20s. I think that's probably most of the student, I have younger siblings and I know that age group. I do worry about their ability to see reform and not complete demolition of the system as the way forward. And I think that is the biggest obstacle right now in encouraging Arab American youth and perhaps those in the older generation, but I think to a much lesser extent, encouraging them to go out there and to vote, or to at least to assert themselves in civic life when they don't like something, or they want to see policies change. I think too often you find that these kids are more, well, I don't want to call them kids, but they, you know, this particular age range may be more willing, for example, to go to a protest like they were doing this summer, but not following that up with the necessary steps that if you want to see reforms in your society, if you know, if you want to improve any of the elements around you, then you need to be engaged. You need to be, well, first and foremost, educated about the issues, and then go out there and be engaged in political life. I think that that's something that the community still struggles with. I can tell you from the Syrian American community, that's something that we have. It's much less of an obstacle. The past 10 years, I think the Syrian American community has really asserted its, I mean, we've been incredibly engaged with, you know, whether it was the Obama administration and the Trump administration. At every level of government, every branch of government, at the local level, federal level, in trying to, you know, push forward policy, policy ideas and policy solutions to policymakers. And it's also important to note that, you know, the Syrian American community, I think because of the way the Syrian conflict has played out, tends to be very pro-American. And so they're more inclined to want to participate, to see even, you know, government service in this country as a you know, what's the word I'm looking for? Just a really admirable thing. And I think that you don't necessarily see that same level of excitement. I mean, I remember growing up, you know, prior to September 11th, and I think many of us can probably, you know, relate to this, that, you know, service in the FBI or the CIA or in government was not necessarily encouraged in Arab American communities. And I think a big part of that is because the Arab world sort of looked at America with not necessarily with the same, you know, just negatively, frankly, what the United States stood for, even though we were here. But I think that those attitudes have changed, I can say, at least on behalf of the Syrian American community. And my hope is that it's changing in some of the other, you know, hyphenated Arab communities here.
Jeffrey, I'm going to send this next question your way first. You know, in some election cycles, it's very clear whether the priority is foreign or domestic policy. I'm not sure if that is so clear this time around. And I wanted to ask you, from the Arab American perspective, what do you think is the priority of voters in going to the polls? And what are some of the, well, I'll leave it there. That's a question in and of itself, and then we'll move on to some foreign policy issues.
Well, I would say, to be quite honest, as I mentioned earlier, and I agree a lot with what Naseem and Jomana mentioned regarding activism, and that younger generation when it comes to activism, as I mentioned in my earlier remarks, I don't tend to think that we could either prioritize foreign policy over domestic policy, or if you want to talk about issues or interests, that one could clearly delineate the boundaries between them and just say, it's all about the economy all over again. But it's quite clear that if we're going to talk more about the progressive side of the new face, the new generation of Arab Americans, we are talking about issues that matter to them in terms of what is a stable economy. And this is a problem when they compare to their parents. And I know this up close and personal when it comes to my own parents that were in America and California in the 80s. The America that they describe is not an America that any person right now that's going to vote for the first time would actually be able to relate to in any shape or form. And this is across the board, right? And when I'm talking about that kind of America, I think this is where the rhetoric plays a very important role. And this is where I somewhat would be very cautious about, does activism really turn into doing this reform and doing that reform by actually voting, or not just giving up and saying that this is just going to get worse. We haven't seen much of what's going to happen with the pandemic in terms of the economic actual recession that everyone's waiting to happen. It's happening. And you were mentioning this earlier on in terms of how many businesses have closed down, what we mean by rising prices of living, accommodation, tuition. So if I'm gonna focus on a centric version that's gonna be really looking at what young Arab Americans want, it really is gonna come down over and over again to having a strong and stable economy, but not in a way of just saying that's separate on its own without thinking about bigger implications of what does that mean to have a strong economy. So this is how I see it, and it's very difficult not to include with that what's going to happen with the stereotypes, bigotry, hate crimes, the differences between Muslim Americans and Arab Americans and how they're perceived, problems with how these different the young generation on campuses, how they're being dealt with different administrations. All of these are important issues, I would say, and it's not really something I can pinpoint directly and say it's only about one issue. But if I were to sum it up all and say what is the most important thing on their mind, is really well knowing if they're gonna get, as Jomana was saying, their share, quote unquote, of what they perceive the American dream to be, even though it's flawed on many, many levels, but it still remains an important aspect to them when it comes to their freedom, their dignity, but more importantly, their ability and well-being to be able to build and be able to basically survive. And this is the debate that I saw happen very strongly over the summer with all the protests that were going on in terms of why we're going nowhere if we don't actually revamp the system rather than just try to fix it by going back and forth, coming down to the same two candidates or the same two political parties. That's the vibe that I read and I analyze when I look at different polls and when I look at different studies when it comes to Arab American attitudes, particularly younger ones.
Thank you.
Sarah, one quick comment. I'm sorry, one quick comment.
Of course.
So in a poll that's coming out today by the Arab American Institute, the number one issue for Arab Americans is race relations. And the number two issue is economy. So I think for young Arab Americans, race relations, sort of Trump's rhetoric, I think is very important. Having said that, definitely there's a segment of the Arab American population that is very economically focused.
Let's talk about foreign policy anyway, right? Let's just focus for a second on the concerns that you see within the community regarding each candidate's stance on issues. And of course, I'm thinking Iran first and foremost, but then also Palestine, Syria, and the Saudis. Naseem, I'm going to toss to you first.
So I think Palestine is not really a major issue for a lot of Arab Americans right now, with the exception of the Palestinian community. They're definitely very activist on the issue. And honestly, the issue with Palestine is moving to more of a concern for Palestinians and Jewish Americans, especially progressive Jewish Americans who are beginning more and more to identify with the Palestinian cause. Iran is certainly a concern for many Lebanese Americans, and I think certainly a large portion of Lebanese Americans support Trump's position on Iran, and I think that's probably one of the reasons you see some support for Trump among Lebanese Americans. So I think foreign policy, especially if you look at the poll that AAI, Arab American Institute, is coming out with today, foreign policy is like the concern for 5% of Arab Americans. So it's not a major issue right now. Domestic issues, race relations, economy, healthcare, those are the main issues.
Anyone else want to briefly chime in on that before I move on?
I'll just mention one quick thing. A recent poll that came out from a colleague in Qatar, and we can go into the dynamics of what does this mean to think about a poll being conducted in Qatar nowadays compared to the UAE. But the general constructs of that study, because it's building on several polls, is that when we think about foreign policy, according to Arab Americans, we need to think about the differences between how they are perceiving American basically actions and attitudes towards autocrats and the elites in different places around the Middle East, and whether that's going to translate to actually having even development or being able to think about more progressive or more inclusive societies across the region. So when you read that lens and think about foreign policy on issues of normalization, that's where it gets very contentious. And I agree with Naseem regarding maybe right now it's not important. Maybe it's not going to translate automatically what we're going to look at next week in terms of results. But on the longer run, there is that schism, if you want. There is that breaking point between the masses, specifically ones living in America right now, and thinking about the trajectory of pushing Iran, containing Iran, and opening up new channels that maybe could lead to better cooperation in the region. But does that translate to having more inclusive societies? Does that translate to the masses and their demands after 2010, 2011, with the Arab uprisings, or even the protests that broke out in the region just in 2019, including Lebanon, including Iraq, and elsewhere? So to what extent is there basically, we can think of Biden versus Trump and be able to think that one approach is going to be better for being able to create a better relationship between Arab Americans living in the States and ones that actually want to go back home or still have family back home that are not going to be impacted or affected by what some would say a very smart decision by Trump, but what others actually would criticize and say that it happened on the level of a group of monarchs rather than on the level of actual inclusion for everyone in society.
Thank you. Lebanon is actually also at a very pivotal moment right now, and also a moment where it has the world's attention, and specifically has the attention of Americans, even those who are not of Arab descent. And so I want to ask you, again, open to all three of you, what are the candidates' positions and plan, I guess, for the country? Do either of them have a plan to deal with Lebanon?
Well, Antony Blinken, who is Biden's foreign policy advisor, had an online event with the Lebanese American community to talk specifically about Lebanon. So certainly, I think the Biden campaign is trying to make the point that yes, they do care about Lebanon, they do care about assistance. And I think in terms of addressing the issue of Iran that is of concern to, and Hezbollah that is of concern to many Lebanese Americans, the Biden campaign and Antony Blinken made the point that once they start renegotiating with Iran, they're going to take into account regional considerations, which presumably includes Hezbollah. Now, we'll see what happens in reality, but I think that is the point that they're trying to make, is that it's not going to be just a nuclear discussion, but it's also going to be the influence of Iran in the region.
Jomana, I'll toss to you.
No, I mean, I attended the same meeting Naseem is talking about, so I have nothing to add to that.
Jeffrey?
I would just add one important thing that if we want to think about actor-based perspectives and think about the differences between Trump and Biden, whatever the outcome is going to be, we have to keep in mind that there are things that are set in motion when it comes to basically I would say a very structural argument in terms of the leeway that's going to be available for Trump if he's re-elected, or Biden, to be able to reverse some of the trends that are growing and growing. So in terms of Lebanon, for instance, I think it's a concern for either administration to figure out what to do with the maritime borders between Israel and Lebanon. And that's also on the agenda as a very important element. And maybe it's not a priority when it comes to how foreign policy advisors to both presidents are talking about right now. But under the larger framework of trying to push for more rapprochement between different states in the region and using the devastating explosion on August 4 as a moment to, if you want, revitalize American standing in the region and American-French, I wouldn't say competition as much as I would say divergence on whether they're going to support the same group of politicians that have been there for years and years and years, and whether that's going to create a new result. I think there is a concern for both administrations, whatever we're gonna see next week happen with the results, that maybe change is required, but having the status quo remain as is for now is better than having more disruptions down the road. So I tend to think that even if we have different administrations in office, when it's going to come down to Lebanon, the connection that Naseem mentioned regarding Iran and Hezbollah and the use of sanctions is going to be very similar. I can't think of a radical change or a radical breaking point between Biden or Trump when it comes to how they view Iran, Syria, and Hezbollah in the region, and their connections to Iraq and their connections to Yemen, and what that means in terms of what they're both in different ways talking about when they conceive of and think of a new Middle East.
So we have a question from the audience.
Sarah, if
yep.
you allow me to add to what Jeff.
Of course. And then we're going to take our first question. Go ahead, Jomana.
No, just I mean, I think the one point that I would extract from that is that, I mean, I think both Republicans and Democrats are trying to find a way to do, to responsibly do much less in the region. How they do that, I think, will be different. And I think that's where you're going to see the most divergence in terms of, you know, who the United States will see sort of as our most trusted allies, and sort of our own proxies in the region that can, you know, that we entrust to sort of take care of the region's security, and then simultaneously, you know, benefit the United States. And I think so. I do think they're both looking for ways to achieve similar goals, but they will likely do it in different ways.
Okay, our first question from an audience member is whether or not anyone has any general statistic or a number of how many Arab Americans or Muslim Americans are running in this election cycle for local office and then also at the national level.
Well, the Arab American Institute has those numbers. I mean, I haven't seen the last report that they have, but I would guess at least 50, 60 across the country, various, you know, state offices and school boards and, you know, small town mayors. So there's certainly a fairly large number of Arab Americans running for various offices.
I have a follow-up to that, which is it getting easier for an Arab American to run for office here in the US, or is it harder under the Trump administration and sort of some of the trickle-down effect of some of that rhetoric?
I think it's easier, honestly, because it's a lot of first of all, the Arab American community is is becoming more activist, and second, I think maybe 15, 20 years ago, the Arab American label was a negative. I don't think it's a negative anymore. I think Arab Americans are becoming more part of the social fabric of the US, so I don't think that's a negative.
Does that change when you switch the language a little bit and use the term Muslim American? And of course, you know, there are many Arab Americans who are not Muslim, but does it become harder?
Depends on the community, I think.
And just on the point of numbers as well, Sarah, I'd add just one thing. If I'm not mistaken, last time I checked, there were 9 individuals running for the House of Representatives, if I'm not mistaken. I'll check that, but I think the number Naseem mentioned is he's totally right across the board. But if I'm thinking about the House of Representatives, I think 9 people are running out of the originally conceived number that was around 55 in February almost. So this shows more and more activism. And I think in response to Nadia as well, I think the factor of fear in terms of basically going beyond it and having faces out there for the actual community has become something that is very vividly clear between 2016 and 2020. And I wouldn't say the same thing about 2018, to be quite honest, but I would say that in 2020, it's becoming more of if we go back to Naseem's poll right now, that if race is the most important issue, that's going to translate into vocal forms of activism And those vocal forms of activism would directly translate to having, quote unquote, people from your own community running for different offices. And I think that breaks the fear barrier even more, and maybe is maybe constructed under the view of having or trying to push for change from within by drawing on the numbers and the sense of activism that we can see in different states, and not only the typical cases that everyone likes to point out to, like California, Florida, Iowa. We can talk about different places in America right now that are going to be important with a significant community of Arab Americans.
How large is the young Arab American vote? How big of a community is that? Will it have an impact?
I don't know. I don't have really any actual numbers. I don't know if the other panelists do.
I don't have numbers as well, but my concern when Naseem and Jomana were talking about activism is, well, will that activism really translate into action, right? It's different to be active in terms of organizing on campus, on the campus level, pushing for, choosing for an alternative. And my concern is that if I compare to, and this is where we move beyond the exceptionalism of Arab Americans and just think about any young American today, right? If I were to use that language and be able to think about any young American today, and I saw this up close and personal when I was teaching and working in America with my students, where they're able to vote, but they didn't feel that there's a necessity to do it. So they're very active, but didn't translate automatically into getting them to go and walk basically the last important mile in that long journey. So I don't know if this can be used also to understand the experience of the young Arab Americans, but to a certain extent, I would say we don't have actual numbers that could really pinpoint to being active translates automatically to going and voting. But at least that's an aspiration that if they want to change, as Jomana mentioned and Naseem mentioned, if they really are yearning to change, does that mean that they're happy with the available choices? Are they going to go into the lesser of two evils argument again? Or is it really going to be something that's going to be different this time? And they're really maybe going to vote this cycle and hopefully in the next 4 years do something else. I'm not sure where to stand on this, but I am hopeful about the activism, but I'm also worried about how much that's going to translate at the end of the day when it comes to actual numbers and actual change.
Naseem has something to add as well.
Yeah, one quick comment on the Arab Americans running for office. There's a congressional race in California, in the San Diego area, where you have two Arab Americans running for Congress against each other. You have Darrell Issa, who's running on the Republican ticket, and you have Ammar Campa-Najjar, who is Palestinian Mexican, running on the Democratic ticket. So that label, Arab American label, is really, I don't think it's as negative as it used to be.
I'm going to add in a question from the audience about foreign policy. And of course, you know, as the moderator, in the back of my mind, Naseem, your statistic about 5%, that's a 5% priority, of course, is nagging at me a little bit right now. But the question is, the Trump administration successfully brokered peace agreements between Israel and 3 Arab countries. Biden wants to re-engage with Iran, and with Iran that wants a perpetual war. Is this a factor? Apparently only 5%.
I think Iran is a factor for certainly Lebanese Americans. The diplomatic or the normalization, I don't think it's really a significant issue. I mean, Democrats are supportive of normalization. Maybe the difference is that Democrats are saying, well, that's not the end of the story. We still need to solve the Palestine-Israeli problem. But I think, I don't think normalization is a big issue for most Arab Americans.
Yeah, I would agree as well with what Naseem mentioned, but I would also add that maybe in my reading of Biden's view of how to move forward with Iran, I think there is a clear message that he's trying to send out in different circles, that he wants to distance himself from what the Obama administration did when it comes to the deal, but not to the extent that we are seeing it with Trump. And I think he's going to push for a dual approach to a large extent, where we could see maybe a renewed attempt at trying to re-engage Iran, not only through sanctions and not only through basically what happened with Qasem Soleimani in the beginning of the year, or other targeted assassinations, or within Syria. But what I would say that if I compare both candidates when it comes to how they're viewing bipartisan support for Israel, I think that is across the board. It's very hard to be able to say that when we think about bipartisan politics across the board. It's always been that when it comes to Israel, there is a commitment that does transcend party line to an extent where that if this is the way moving forward in terms of normalization, that's not going to be reversed. I think Biden's going to be able to even capitalize on that even further, but that doesn't mean that they're going to maybe follow in the footsteps of the Trump administration when it comes to Iran and Hezbollah, even though there are some constants in U.S. foreign policy after the Cold War ended, and these constants are very clear when it comes to energy security, when it comes to access to oil, when it comes to maintaining the status quo, even though it's going to come at the expense of keeping many authoritarian regimes in power. It'd be quite hard to reverse these dynamics, regardless of who we have in office and regardless of who we have at state or at other organizations within the US and actually in the region as well.
So we have a couple more questions I want to get to before we run out of time. Are there any specific numbers on campaign donations from the community to political campaigns in the US? And in the interest of time, we do have two more. So if we could just make this one short.
I don't know of specific numbers. I know that for us as Syrian Americans, we do have sort of a pot of money that we've collected. And we did this last round of elections in 2016 for Hillary Clinton. At the time, I think Syrian Americans donated about 1.5 million. The numbers obviously, I think, look different just in this election cycle period, just because of the nature of fundraising events and the economic crisis we're going through. But I know that they also had, for example, a Muslim American fundraiser for the Biden campaign, during which I think I would say possibly about $1 million was collected total for that event. Don't quote me on that, but I mean there have been similar events like that to try to, also put sort of a dollar amount next to specific engagements from different communities.
Another question came up. Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, I mean, maybe that's not representative of contributions to the Biden campaign from Arab Americans, but certainly Arab Americans are becoming more, they're contributing more to political campaigns. And I think that has to do with people like Rashida Tlaib, that has to do with people like Betty McCollum, people who are members of Congress who are big on certain issues of concern to the Arab American community.
Another question from the audience. Is there a sectarian element in the Arab American vote?
Yes, I think. And I mentioned in one of my notes, if you look at Michigan, for example, you have 150,000 Iraqi Christians, Chaldeans and Assyrians. And I think they are voting as a majority for Trump because they are socially conservative and many of them are small business owners. So I think economic issues are of concern for them. But I think the majority, there's a bigger, among Biden's supporters, among Arab Americans, the bigger portion is obviously Muslim Americans.
And I would just add one thing to that we mentioned earlier on, that this is very vividly strong in the Lebanese American community as well, when it comes to support for Trump on Iran. And this has to do with how many different, I would say, Arab communities in America identify, and what is actually how they're under an umbrella category of being Arabs, but sometimes when it comes to their identity, they often during moments of elections, project a different view. And that different view could have elements of a sectarian identity, but it's also intertwined with, obviously, economic concerns as well.
The last question we have from an audience member: is it true that there are many undeclared Trump voters, especially amongst Arab Americans in Michigan? Which was one of the things top of mind for me too, which is there a sort of a stigma for voting for Trump that prevents Arab Americans from accurately, from the polls, I guess, being accurate, which is something that we all are very aware of in this election cycle because of what happened in 2016?
I don't see it. I think people are supporters of Trump, even in the Arab American community. Don't hide it. I mean, they will tell you, I don't like Trump. I think he's, his rhetoric and his tweets and all this is I don't like it. But I care for his economic policies and for his tax cuts. So the idea that there's a silent Trump supporter out there, maybe that was the case in 2016. I don't think it's as prevalent today.
Well, if no one else has a comment on that, it would be a miracle, but we actually are going to wrap up exactly on time. And I appreciate everyone who asked some fantastic questions, our panelists. I don't know about you all in attendance, but I certainly learned a lot. I really appreciate this conversation, and thank you for joining us. And I'm going to toss it back over to Nadim.
Hello, thank you all for a very stimulating conversation. I'm sure we're all observing what's happening between now and next week. I can't believe it's going to be next week. I'll be back in New York by then. And I don't vote, perhaps, unfortunately, so I will just be an independent observer. A very concerned independent observer. Thank you.
Thank you for having us, Nadim.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.